Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. The Pyramid of Khafre on the Giza Plateau is the second largest in all of Egypt, a truly incredible feat of engineering, but the truth is, it's very much in the shadow of its big brother, the Great Pyramid. Due to the fact it's built on slightly higher ground, to the untrained eye it does look to be taller. And for this reason, and also because of its central position on the Giza Plateau, where from a certain angle you can perfectly frame the head of the Sphinx, it is often mistaken for the Great Pyramid. It is an easy mistake to make, and in all fairness it is only a few metres shorter. It's great in nature, just not in name. And you can even argue it's more impressive to look at, with its 43 courses of fine Chura limestone casing still in place around the top. But below the casing, the exposed core masonry does look far more dilapidated. It doesn't have the tidy step-like appearance we see on the Great Pyramid, where you can count, measure and climb, well, not without permission, each individual course of masonry from the bottom to the top. But what truly makes the Great Pyramid great is the interior, the magnificent and complex layout of passages and chambers, with the ornate 46-metre long grand gallery with its high corbelled ceiling, the unfinished rough and rugged rock-cut subterranean chamber, and the beautifully polished granite-lined King's Chamber. We also have the Queen's Chamber, and although inferior to the King's Chamber in many ways, it does have a number of features that are truly unique, and are still not fully understood today. We also have the 4 small shafts inside the Great Pyramid, 2 of which emanate from the King's Chamber and 2 from the Queen's. These are unique architectural features, their function still uncertain, and we don't find them in any other pyramid at Giza. Or do we? Well, that's the subject of this video, as I take us into the heart of the Khafre Pyramid, to take a look at 2 specific features that are often overlooked. They're noted by tourists, drawn on historic sketches, and on seeing these square holes on the north and south walls of the burial chamber, it's easy to make the connection to the King's and Queen's chambers of the Great Pyramid. So, does the Khafre Pyramid also have small air shafts emanating from the burial chamber? What are these roughly square-shaped holes in the walls? Well, let's take a closer look. Compared to the Great Pyramid, the internal layout of the Khafre Pyramid is more basic, being almost entirely dug into the bedrock. There are 2 entrances into the pyramid, both of which are on the northern side, one in the ground and one on the northern face, both of which open into separate corridors that join up before you reach the central structure, the burial chamber. This chamber is entirely cut from the Giza limestone bedrock. These are not floor slabs, and the walls are not made from stacked blocks of limestone. The room was quarried, and according to Flinders Petrie, who inspected the pyramid well over 100 years ago, defects in the bedrock inside the chamber were patched up with the addition of limestone rocks, and then all of the walls were stuccoed, aka plastered. But the roof is not bedrock, being made with finely fitted limestone beams. The gabled ceiling and the overall beige limestone appearance we see today means the chamber is very reminiscent of the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, although it is larger in every dimension. We also know it was once plastered. The walls measure 5.24 metres in height, with the gabled ceiling rising to 6.84 metres at the apex. The chamber is 14.15 metres long and 4.97 metres in width. You enter on the northern side, east of the chamber's north-south axis, but what we see today is very different to how it looked when Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni entered in 1818. As you enter the chamber, You'll notice you're stood on what looks like a platform, as the floor of the eastern end is 40 centimetres higher than the rest of the room. A very deliberate step has been cut into the bedrock. On the western side you can see the centrepiece, the granite sarcophagus, and this is surrounded by more blocks of granite. But what's missing between the bedrock platform and the granite coffer is the original limestone pavement, shown on this sketch, and it was made of fine limestone, but it was ripped up by explorer John Shea Perring in the early 19th century. By the time Flinders Petrie entered the chamber, the paving slabs were stacked up at the eastern end. Interestingly, Perring did find some hieroglyphic markings on the underside of the paving stones, as shown here. If the paving stones were still in place, the floor would have been flat and it would have looked visually stunning, with the simple yet beautiful granite sarcophagus sunken into the floor. So why did Perring destroy the pavement? Well, sadly, destructive exploration is what was done in the 19th century, and Perring had a hunch the pavement was hiding a secret passage. The size and layout of the Khafre Burial Chamber is very reminiscent of the upper chamber in the Pyramid of Khafre. They're both 27 cubits long, both have their entrances on the northern side, 5 cubits from the eastern wall, and it is thought that this space in the Khafre pyramid was the original planned location for the sarcophagus, positioned at the western end. The main difference between the two is the descending passageway in the floor in Khafre's chamber. If you look at the two side by side in this diagram created by Keith Hamilton, you can see the position of the descending passageway in Khafre's chamber matches up with the position of the limestone paving in Khafre's. So, Perring had a hunch, and it does look to be a fair assumption. So, the floor was ripped up, but he found nothing. He also dug below the sarcophagus, but again, he found nothing. But even after all of this, he still believed that this room was not Khafre's burial chamber, and that's probably because of his knowledge of the internal layout of Khafre's pyramid, which is far more complex. There are also other architectural features to note, such as this somewhat neat pit against the southern wall, sunken into the floor, and this is thought to have once held a canopic chest. Here's an example of a canopic chest from the 4th dynasty. It belonged to Heta Perez, the mother of Khufu and grandmother of Khafre, and it was discovered in tomb G7000X, located next to the Great Pyramid. Although the walls are cut from the Giza bedrock, as stated, the gabled ceiling is made from large blocks of limestone, and the work really is of the finest quality. The joints are very fine, and interestingly, when Belzoni entered in 1818, he commented the chamber had a painted ceiling. To what extent he doesn't say, but all traces of this paint have now gone. Regarding the pavement, even before Perring ripped up the floor, Belzoni noted that many of the stones had been removed from their place, and that's because we know the chamber was entered into hundreds of years ago, because historic graffiti was found on the walls. Whilst I could go on about the finer details of this chamber, and also the pyramid as a whole, what I want to focus on in this video are the two opposing shafts, one cut in the northern wall and the other in the south, both of which are opposite one another. Now when we look at the King's Chamber, the heart of the Great Pyramid, we see a somewhat empty rectangular room with an entrance on the north wall, a granite coffer at the western end, and two small shafts in the northern and southern walls. Then we look at the Khafre Burial Chamber, the heart of the second pyramid, and again we have a somewhat empty rectangular room with an entrance on the northern wall, a granite coffer at the western end, and two small shafts in the northern and southern walls. Therefore, because of these similarities, it is easy for our brains to make a connection, and with both chambers having small shafts cut into the northern and southern walls, with the pyramids apparently built by father and son, and positioned right next to each other, Well, surely these shafts in both pyramids had a similar function. Like, whatever they are, must be some 4th dynasty standard for the main burial chamber of a pyramid. But it's only when we look at them in detail and refer to books from 200 years ago that we start to see the clear differences. For a start, there is an obvious difference in their positioning, being much higher up the walls in the Khafre pyramid. Situated nearly 4 metres above the floor, you can't see into them without the use of a ladder, whilst the shafts in the Great Pyramid King's Chamber are accessible, being just over a metre from the floor. The openings of the shafts in the Khafre Pyramid are also much larger in comparison, in both height and width, as shown here. In the Great Pyramid, the shafts also go on for some distance, with the King's Chamber shafts running all the way through the core masonry and exiting the pyramid, hence their interpretation as air shafts. But the shafts in the Khafre Burial Chamber are just 29 cm and 34 cm deep respectively. Other reports say they're 33 cm and 43 cm in depth, but either way they don't go deep into the limestone, and according to Flinders Petrie, the backs of the holes are quite irregular, and to him they looked unfinished. Of course, it's also possible they were never meant to be finished. So although we can see some cosmetic similarities between the two chambers in the two pyramids, the differences in the shafts are clear to see, and in my opinion, they didn't have the same function. I'll explain why. In the Great Pyramid, the shafts were not an afterthought. Specific shaft blocks were shaped and used from start to finish in all 4 shafts. They were part of the architectural plan from the get-go. You could never build an enormous pyramid and cut tiny shafts all the way through after it was built. It just wasn't possible. So, if the Khafre Pyramid architectural plan was for it to have small shafts running from the burial chamber all the way to the outside, well, they would have had to have been partly cut into the bedrock and partly made with masonry, because remember, the burial chamber is cut into the bedrock. This means that before the core masonry of the Khafre Pyramid was laid down on top, the beginnings of the shafts, the parts in the bedrock, would have had to have been finished to the point where they intersect with the masonry, so that you could lay down specific shaft blocks to line up perfectly when you build the pyramid. The fact the 2 holes are just 29 cm and 34 cm deep says to me the architect of the pyramid either changed his mind early on, or for me what's more probable is that these shafts were never intended to be pyramid air shafts. And remember, Petrie did say that any defects in the walls were filled with stones, and then the walls were plastered over to create a perfect finish. With that in mind, if these were planned to be air shafts, a project that started but was then scrapped, these holes would surely have been filled in and plastered over. This to me says they're not air shafts, and the holes in the walls did have a different function. To understand what's going on, we have to look to the Pyramids and Temples of Giza by Flinders Petrie, published in 1883. Where he notes there were 2 vertical red construction lines drawn on both the northern and southern walls, emanating from the edges of each hole. These look to be guidelines, because further down each wall, it looks like another square opening has been marked out, to line up with the ones higher up, ready to be chiselled out. These marked out squares begin 2 metres above the floor, and so they're still higher than the shaft openings in the Great Pyramid King's Chamber. Interestingly, the guidelines, and hence the position of the openings and the ones marked out in red, are precisely at the point where the pavement begins in the burial chamber, at the step we see today, and I for one agree with the explanation from Keith Hamilton, which he writes in his fantastic guide to the Khafre Pyramid that I've linked below. The most likely explanation for the holes, guidelines and marked out squares is to create a dividing wall in the burial chamber. You would have two wooden beams running across, and this would have supported a lightweight partition, maybe made of wood, and this would have been plastered over and possibly painted. As stated, the two marked out red squares are 2 meters from the floor, so there is plenty of room to insert a doorway inside the partition so you didn't hit your head on the wooden beam above. So, by splitting the room into 2, from the entrance corridor you would first enter an antechamber, and then this would lead into the burial chamber. But however likely this explanation is, it is still very strange, because the room is clearly unfinished. This partition was never made because the lower square was never cut out and the guidelines were still painted on the walls. So how could the burial chamber, the heart of the second biggest pyramid in Egypt, cut into the bedrock before the pyramid above was even constructed, be unfinished? Yet the evidence suggests it is. Therefore, it does seem plausible that this partition was a very late addition to the chamber. Maybe the original plan was to have a simple limestone room with a freestanding sarcophagus at the western end. But then there was a change in plan to make it more elaborate, to quarry down further and install a beautiful paved floor, complete with a sunken sarcophagus, with a partition to turn the space into 2 rooms. Alternatively, the changes to the burial chamber could have been done much later, maybe as late as the 18th, 19th, 21st or 26th dynasties, because we know that inside the sarcophagus, Belzoni found the remains of a bull and not those of King Khafre, showing that this chamber had more than one phase of use. The structures on the Giza Plateau would no doubt have been looted and the mummies desecrated, and that would have happened long before any 19th century explorer came along, maybe as early as the first intermediate period, just after the Old Kingdom. We also know that many later kings renovated and modified existing structures and also built new ones at Giza, like Amenhotep II's New Sphinx Temple and the 18th dynasty Temple of Isis. Ramesses the Great also took stone from Giza monuments, including the Khafre Pyramid itself, to modify old and build new structures in Memphis. The Romans also built at Giza, the most famous example being this staircase over the original Sphinx temple. Ever since the pyramids were built 4,500 years ago, Giza has never been left alone, and we really don't know the full history of the pyramids. We don't know the level of modification that has taken place. People say the pyramids are not tombs because there were no mummies or hieroglyphs inside, but the same people fail to mention the fact that Al-Idrisi said the ceiling of the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid was originally painted when he entered, and that the ceiling of the Khafre Burial Chamber was also painted as seen by Giovanni Belzoni, and that the entire chamber was originally plastered as noted by Petrie. These pyramids are not in the same condition they were once in. They were not sealed up in the 4th dynasty and then reopened for the first time thousands of years later. They would have been entered into throughout the course of history by future kings, conquerors, looters, explorers, and so on. They've changed so much in just 200 years, so imagine how much has changed and also disappeared in the 4,300 years before. The holes in the walls of the Khafre Pyramid Burial Chamber are another pyramid mystery, another unknown. But because it looks like there was meant to be 2 holes in each wall, and lining up precisely with the step we see today, aka the beginning of the limestone pavement, well, to me these holes are surely construction related, and the most logical interpretation is they were meant to hold wooden beams, and these would have supported a partition. Work that was started but never finished, sometime after the pyramid was built. Maybe just after, or maybe hundreds and hundreds of years later. With the Khafre Pyramid always being in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, It doesn't get the attention or exploration it deserves, and there are many anomalies and unknowns associated with it. So please subscribe to the Ancient Architects channel because I have more videos planned in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.